I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. This episode, I'm talking BioChar with Craig Sams, the co-founder of Carbon Gold, a company that produces a range of biochar products for the garden, but also for agricultural use. Before this interview, I think it's fair to say I knew more about Craig than about his product because he is a legend in many fields, not least in food and growing. He founded the first macrobiotic restaurant in London in 1967 and went on to start Harmony Foods, which later became Whole Earth Foods. He and his friends provided the food for the first ever Glastonbury Festival in 1972. And in 1991, he and his wife Josephine Fairley founded Green and Blacks. He was chair of the Soil Association from 2001 to 2007 and is the author of 4 books, including the seminal text about macrobiotics. First off, I asked Craig to explain what biochar is.
Biochar is charcoal. The difference is that it's what you do with it. That biochar is charcoal that you put in the ground and that you don't use to barbecue your sausages or whatever. The term biochar defines that. In practice, biochar is, when it's made specifically to be used as biochar, is processed in very slightly different ways. And people are still experimenting with different heat levels and different particle sizes and all the rest. But basically, biochar is charcoal.
So you couldn't get your barbecue charcoal and put that in your soil, presumably? You could.
You could take lumpwood charcoal, not the briquettes, because but you have to grind it up, and you have to grind it up to make it effective. You really want the particle size to be under 10 millimeters. And really, you want it to be almost dust, because everything is happening at a microscopic level.
Right, okay. So when you say it's to do with the process of making it, does it matter what you put in to make the biochar? And do you use the same thing time and again when you make Carbon Gold?
We use hardwood charcoal. The difference is you've got, the Japanese use bamboo charcoal a lot because they have a lot of bamboo. Bamboo has very large cells. Hardwood has very small cells, and conifers are somewhere in between. The cell size is slightly important because part of the function, an important part of the function of biochar is that it is what's called a refugia. So in the soil, you've got mycorrhizal fungi, you've got actinomycetes, bacteria. I could go on and name all 10,000, but I don't remember them all. And they all are working together with the plant to keep the plant healthy, to supply it with nutrients and defend it against pathogens, the fungi that normally would only attack a dead plant. The plant is making sugar in its leaves with photosynthesis, so it's sending it down to feed this bacterial community. That's fine. If you imagine gazelles grazing on grass, that's fine too. But then along come the lions and tigers to pick off the surplus population. In the soil, the lions and tigers are protozoa, mites, nematodes, amoebae. They're little tiny organisms that we can't actually see, but they're a lot bigger than a bacterium or a fungal cell. A protozoa, just one protozoa, needs to eat 50,000 bacteria a day to keep going. If you are a bacterium, you divide every 20 minutes. So actually, if you do the maths, after 7 hours, you are 50,000 bacteria if there aren't any protozoa around to keep your population down. Mm-hmm. When you have biochar in the soil, the bacteria and the fungi go into the pores, the original cell structure of the wood that made the biochar, and they hide there. Just as your ancestors, our ancestors, would go into caves to keep the saber-toothed tigers out. So there is an argument that the smaller pore sizes, bacteria, even with the smallest pore sizes, they don't have any problem getting in and out, but that keeps out predators. And that's also the argument for having lots of tiny pieces of biochar, because then that's lots of little fortresses that the beneficial fungi and bacteria can hide in.
How did people start making biochar?
People have been making charcoal going back to the beginning of time. Coal, eyeshadow, the root of that word is in the Egyptian word for charcoal. And we still use the word coal to describe carbon. In German or Dutch, koolhydraten means carbohydrate. Coal just means carbon. We've always been making charcoal. There are few examples in West Africa and a few examples in parts of Europe, Swabia in particular, where people used charcoal as an agricultural amendment. And even allotmentiers in this country, they would have deliveries of soot from local chimney sweeps that they would use to enhance their soil. It wasn't quite biochar, but it was on the way. What we discovered about 80 or 90 years ago was as the Amazon rainforest was being cleared, there were certain areas that had what the Brazilians call terra preta, which means black earth, dark earth. And those areas were incredibly fertile, so that farmers who had land on that terra preta would actually sell it in bags at garden centers and by the truckload to fellow farmers, because it went down 10 or 12 feet. So they could just hoover up a couple of feet off the surface and sell the land rather than the produce of the land. The people then sort of looked at where did this all come from? And the answer goes right back to the early Spanish invasions of Latin America, of South America. And Pizarro, who was busy looting the Inca cities up in the Andes Mountains, was told by somebody, you know, if you think the Incas are rich, you should go down this river. There are cities down there, populations, who are insanely rich, and they have gold. So, of course, being Spanish, he got excited. They built a boat up in the mountains or up in the Andes, and Pizarro's brother and a guy called Francisco de Orellana sailed down the Amazon. And sure enough, they came to this area which Francisco de Orellana described as more rich and fertile than the finest lands of Castile and Aragon back in Spain, and populated with busy farms, really wealthy. We went ashore and we were repelled by people with spears and arrows. Our boat looked like a porcupine as we retreated, and they were led by women with hair down to their knees and gold around their necks, who would club to death any man who showed signs of cowardice. He then sailed down the river. He couldn't get back up, and noted wherever there were these rich population centers, but he never went ashore again. And when he came out in the Atlantic, having discovered the Amazon, which was named after these Amazonian women, who this very powerful matriarchal civilization, he went back, and the King of Spain had him in court and said, you know, let's get an expedition together. And eventually they went back up the Amazon to get their hands on this gold, and there wasn't anything there, because everybody had died. The reason they repelled them wasn't because they didn't want them to have their gold, but because they knew that if a white man breathed around you, within a few days you would be dead of a cold or measles or smallpox, because they had no natural immunity. So that whole civilization collapsed, and it wasn't really until the last few decades that we discovered that the foundation of the civilization was this incredibly fertile soil. The way they did it was every year, or regularly, they would dig pits, fill it up with their food waste, their forest waste, their animal waste, their own waste, and then cover it up with clay and make it into biochar or charcoal. Exactly the same process that a English charcoal burner would use, putting turfs of grass over the top of their charcoal burn. They used clay because they didn't have turfs of grass. And they would then spread that on their land, and that's what kept their land rich and productive year after year after year.
So we took that principle and brought it back to, well, the UK and other places, obviously. Does it work better on one type of soil, or is it just as good across the board?
If you have sandy soil, it's almost miraculous, because the problems with sandy soil are legendary, but, fine for growing carrots, but anything else, just to stop them forking. But all your nutrients run through. It doesn't matter whether you're using organic fertilizers or chemical fertilizers, they wash through. Your soil structure it's very hard to build a good soil structure. So putting biochar into a sandy soil immediately stimulates the growth of the fungi and bacteria that glue soil particles together. If you have clay soil, probably the other extreme, depending on how degraded that soil is, biochar makes a difference, but it's not as spectacular.
Right.
So it really depends. And then you've got your loams, your silty soils in between. It always seems to do something. And the main things are, it has what's called cation exchange capacity. So a teaspoon of biochar has the surface area of 2 tennis courts, which means that there are lots of little points that magnetically stick. So there are positive and negative points that stick to the positive and negative points in minerals. So your nitrates or your manganese or boron or whatever your nutrients are, don't wash through the soil when it rains. They stick to that. Also, biochar is porous, so it helps to hold moisture. When the soil is drying out, the bits of biochar have a much higher moisture level. And then the main reason is they're full of the bacteria and fungi that typify healthy soil. And if you have biochar in the soil, even if you're using nitrates, which tend to cause a collapse in the population of beneficial fungi and bacteria, you still keep a good, strong, resilient population of those fungi and bacteria, so that when the disease-causing fungi, which have a place in the world, if we didn't have them eating plants, dead leaves and dead trees, we'd be up to our ears in biomass. They're what break dead biomass down into smaller particles. But you don't want them attacking living biomass, but that's what they do when the living biomass hasn't got its protection in place.
And so does it work with mature plants as well as younger plants, and does it work on all plants?
There is a yew tree in Totteridge that is estimated to be 3,000 years old. It was dying. One biochar treatment, just one treatment, that was 3 years ago. It's thriving now. There's a tree called the Charter Oak in Bexley that was planted to celebrate the royal charter that established Bexley as a town. So it's an ancient oak. It was dying. It got the biochar air spade treatment 18 months ago. It's thriving. And there are many more examples of it. In fact, at Carbon Gold, we now have a promotion called Tree Rescue, where people can nominate a veteran tree that needs help, and we'll do it for free.
Yeah.
Up to a limit.
I saw that on your website. I think that's brilliant. And how is it best applied? I see you've got sort of various different...
If you're starting from scratch, you just mix it into the soil.
Right.
And you really want sort of 5% by volume. If you're potting, potting compost, that sort of thing, we make a potting compost using coir. It's frustrating to me that there are people who are buying our biochar and mixing it with peat, but it makes a big difference to the quality of the plants that you propagate. And, our aim is to get people off peat completely, but we can't stop people doing that when they've paid good money for the product. So it's very good in propagating